A warm welcome to today's video in which I will be explaining Berkeley's Idealism for Philosophy A-Level. I would always define the theory in a practice response the way the exam board defined the theory. The exam board defined the theory as being this. The immediate objects of perception are mind-dependent objects. Okay, and we can understand this using the Latin tagline that Berkeley gives Idealism, inspired by the Latin tagline that Descartes gives his arguments, the cogito. The tagline being SAS percipi. My Latin is not good at all. Now, what this means is to be perceived. And so let's conceive of an apple in our mind. And then let's take away the way it might taste, the way it looks, the way it might feel, the way we might, the way it might smell. And we take all of those things away, and then suddenly we don't have an apple in our mind. We have nothing. So for the apple to be, for the apple to exist, it must be perceived. Because if it isn't being perceived, if we don't have any of the sensory experience, there is no apple. And so that's SAS percipi. Now, we have an attack on the primary and secondary qualities, and that is the foundation of the theory. That's sort of where Idealism starts. If you were connecting all the theories of perception, a good way to revise, by evaluating the pros and the cons of each theory. What's the single biggest weak point of the theory? The single biggest weak point for indirect realism, in my opinion, is the attack on primary and secondary qualities. If you accept the attack, that is explained in my previous video. So, you accept the attack on the primary and secondary qualities, and then you have idealism. Because if the secondary qualities are dependent on the mind, it follows that the primary qualities are also dependent on the mind. Because, as with the apple in our mind, you take away all the you take away the secondary qualities, you don't have any object in your mind. And so it can't have shape or extension because you don't have an object to begin with. And so nothing has no qualities. Okay? Once we've done the attack or covered and understood the attack on primary and secondary qualities, the next thing we need to understand is the likeness principle. Now, I really struggled in understanding the likeness principle. It is only now, having already got my grades, having already got 79 and 80 out of 100 on my exam papers, it is only now that I understand the likeness principle. And I'm hopefully going to use an analogy that will help you understand the likeness principle if you have struggled with it previously. Now, the likeness principle we can explain using this analogy. I'm using football cards. Here is a match attack of Pele. Match attacks are just football, collecting cards, you know. Let's say I want to make a copy. I want to make a replica of the Pele card. You see here some of the qualities that the card has. It has a rating. It has an image of Pele. It has green and blue. It has the country, the flag that Pele is from, and it has the overall rating. If I was copying the card, I would want all of those qualities. Because a copy of something must have most, not all, but most of the same properties, the same qualities. I might want to print it on the card, the same amount of card that the match tag is printed off to get the best, most realistic replica. So a good copy would have lots of the same qualities. Fine. What's the problem then? What is the likeness principle? Well, the likeness principle is just saying, how can physical objects be like ideas? Now, what does that mean? How does the sensible resemble the insensible? So we have the qualities of ideas. okay, the qualities of ideas. So what sort of properties do ideas have? Well, they're in the mind, and we have no idea where they're stored, and they sort of just come and go. We have no control over them. And what qualities do physical objects have? Well, supposedly they're in the world and you can feel them and you can tap them and you can take them apart. We can do none of those things with our ideas. We can't take them apart and feel them and store them in different places. And so how, Berkeley says, how can physical objects resemble ideas? Or how can ideas resemble physical objects? Because they've got none of the same properties. None. Like, they're not even in the same category. They're just completely different things. And so it's absurd to suppose that ideas resemble anything beyond the mind. How can they resemble? How can they be a replica of external objects when they have none of the same properties? Because we know a good replica should have lots of the same properties. If it has none of the same properties, it's not even a replica. It's not even a copy. It's not even a resemblance at all. And that's the likeness principle. Next, we move on to the master argument. Now, the master argument, you are asked, or we can ask ourselves, to conceive of a tree, unperceived by any person. Now, in your mind, you need to conceive of a mind-independent object. That's the master argument. In your mind, you need to conceive of a mind-independent object. And that's impossible. It is impossible to think of a mind-independent object. Why? Because to think of something, to think of a tree, a mind-independent tree that exists in a forest, to think of that is to have it in your mind. And so it's dependent on the mind. So mind-independent objects, conceptions of mind-independent objects, are impossible. And that's the three working parts of idealism. Next, we move on to the criticisms. The first criticism of idealism is non-veridical perceptions. If you are familiar with direct realism, you will know these criticisms. You can just explain them in the same way you would explain them for direct realism. These are things like perceptual variation, hallucination, and illusion. These are a problem for idealism because there seems to be no account for why, because all perception is mind dependent, what I see, what I experience is dependent on the mind. And so there's no explanation for why I have hallucinations, for example. There seems to be no account because it's all dependent on my mind. And so a hallucination is as real as any other type of experience. And yet intuitively, they're not the same. And we have different terms. A hallucination is not just a veridical perception. Because of the distinction of veridical and non-veridical perceptions, there seems to be a difference in those two things. And in idealism, there is no difference between those two things. The next objections, or set of objections I should say, I've grouped these together. These are the common sense objections. For example, the continued existence of things. So I put an apple in a drawer and I leave it, I go on holiday for a month and I come back and the apple has rotted. No one was perceiving it, but the object seems to continue to exist. And that seems like a problem. You can also think of the universe far before there were any agents, any conscious agents there to perceive the universe. We seem to know with reasonable scientific evidence, with reasonable empirical evidence, not that I'm an astronomer by any means, but we're pretty certain that the Earth is older than humans have been on the Earth for. And so, despite no one perceiving time and space seems to have preceded any mind. And so that's another common sense problem. These have a fix, supposedly proposed, or definitely proposed by Berkeley, but it's supposedly it's a fix. It's not really a fix, and we'll cover that in a second. But the next criticism is of solipsism. My experience is completely mind dependent. The key idea here is that I can know nothing of anything, I can be certain of no knowledge, but of my own mind. And so we're really in this solipsistic, I don't know if that's a word, this place of solipsism. And for some, that is a completely unacceptable position to be in. Not a problem for Berkeley because he solved solipsism, the common sense objections, and the issue of non-veridical perceptions with God. And how does he do this? Well, we can understand God as being the all-powerful, ultimate perceiver, the perceiver of all things. And let's quickly explore how God solves all of these issues. Objects continue to exist when we're not perceiving them because God's perceiving them, because God perceives all things at all times. Perfect. Time and space existed before any agent, any human mind. Fine, we can accept that because God was perceiving it before any human mind. Fine. Solipsism. We have no reason to suppose that we're a brain in a vat or being controlled by an evil demon because God exists and God is the ultimate perceiver and all our perceptions originate with God. Because all of our perceptions originate with God, we can explain away non-veridical perceptions. The reason we can do this is because all our consistent sense experience originates with God, and any inconsistent non-veridical perceptions do not originate with God. And that's how we have this distinction. Original ideas came from God, non-original, random, confusing, hallucinatory, non-veridical perceptions originate with our minds and not with the mind of God. So that's how these three issues are solved. I'm sure you can see that this is not palatable. First of all, we don't know that God exists. Berkeley doesn't try to prove God. He would need to. We would need to accept God exists. This is a very, very difficult task to try and prove the existence of God, obviously. And even if you assume God, Berkeley's conception of God is unacceptable. And that's because he changes the definition of God. You can't just change the definition of God from being a perfect divine being to being the perceiver of all things. We have no reason to extend the definition of God to being the perceiver of all things, as well as the divine being, the uncaused cause, however you like to define it. But to stretch it to the perceiver of all things doesn't make sense. We can't really justify that. The reason we can't justify it is because it seems unacceptable and against God's nature to claim that the origin of hate, war, jealousy, crimes, all of these perceptions originate with God. How can they originate with a perfect being? And so that's the attempted fix by Berkeley. The fix does not work. If you want another criticism, a bonus criticism, in an idealism essay, what I would recommend is you attack Berkeley's attack on the primary and secondary qualities. The counter to that issue is explained in my video on indirect realism. Thank you for watching.